Well, good evening. Welcome to our third and final session on Plato's Gorgias. I'm here with Courtney, and we're going to be starting from page 849 on our PDF, which is about section 504 in the Stephanus numbering system. And where we got to last time was Socrates is concluding that, as with other enterprises such as a ship or a house that's being built, it's beneficial for a soul to have order applied to it, order and regularity. And so it's a doctor or a gym trainer who brings order and regularity to the body. But what about the soul? So Socrates concludes that, yep, it's going to be beneficial for the soul as well. And so just as a doctor isn't going to let a person who's unwell eat whatever they like, a good orator, because that's what the role of the orator is, what we're considering in this dialogue, is not going to allow a soul that's defective or has problems to fulfill its desires. Because being disciplined, and the verb here is to kolastisthai, is better for the soul than being undisciplined. And that's the noun he akolasia, which literally means being not disciplined. So did you want to make a comment on these sections, Courtney?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just my computer. It doesn't like it when I jump between screens. And I've got the PDF in front of me, but when I skip to it, the computer kind of has a freak out. That section, is that the section where he talks about order and organization, right?
Yeah. And the next little bit, I actually don't have the PDF up because I've got the, on my other screen, I've got the Lerb, Greek and English. So you'll have to guide me on the PDF, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying not to go to it too much. That's the problem. But there's a bit in there that I actually wrote in my book, because it was a bit like what we were talking about just before in the interim. And he says, he says, the man who speaks with regard to what's best says whatever he says, not randomly, but with a view to something, just like the other craftsmen, each of whom keeps his own product in view, and so does not select and apply randomly what he applies. I thought that was really interesting because he is talking about, I think, boat builders at the start.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so you have to keep the project in view as you're putting it together, otherwise it would be a bad boat, probably sink. But it got me thinking about, obviously he's contrasting two types of oratory, one that makes people better, and having that in mind as you proceed might be saying things that aren't particularly nice to the people. They might get upset, but that doesn't matter because that's what's important. Versus, on the other hand, just applying kind words or nice words, sweet words or whatever, gratifying the mob and treating them like children. And that's quite different from this keeping the order and organization in mind. That's a bit more haphazard and all over the place, kind of trying to get a feel for the temperature of the audience kind of thing. But it got me thinking, as I was saying to you before, about what a therapist does, for example, because I was listening to a class on motivational interviewing, and it seems like a really, to the unknowing observer, it just seems like the person's asking questions when the client speaks, but it's actually the therapist has in mind an agenda and a direction, and he's looking for cues specifically around change. And when they come up, it's just like that. He starts to assemble a kind of order, and he's pushing the client in a certain direction and constantly holding in mind like what his agenda is. So I can see the difference between just persuasive, unfocused talk, sort of, and the kind of thing that is structured towards organizing a kind of result. I know that was a bit long-winded, but I just wanted to kind of explore that a little bit. I think it's very interesting that Socrates is talking about that, because on the one hand, you know, obviously you've got knacks, which are just flattery, and then you've got the crafts, which are using something like a body of knowledge that comment on.
Your video's dropped out, Courtney. I think Courtney's just dropped out for a moment. So I might just continue for a moment here. So I think what Courtney just raised there is very interesting, because the kind of motivational interviewing he's talking about is very much directed towards making a positive change in the audience, which is what Socrates suggests that a good orator is going to do. So that's a very interesting perspective on a way in which that can happen. Oh, here's Courtney coming back in now. Hi,
Wow.
Courtney. You dropped out there for a minute. I was just filling the void by pointing out that I think what you're gesturing towards there with the motivational interviewing is very much what Socrates is suggesting a good orator will do, which is to induce a positive change in the listener. That seems to be a real world example of exactly the kind of positive oratory that he's talking about. So that's incredibly interesting and relevant.
Yeah, and it's interesting how Socrates kind of doesn't mind to upset the audience. That's something quite different from the modern therapist.
Yeah, exactly. And also well, obviously he takes a very humble position. You know, he doesn't set himself above the listener. He's very self-effacing in that sense. But
Yes.
I think what happens next in the dialogue is very interesting, because Callicles isn't very happy with the way things are going. So after Socrates is emphasized and kind of repeated that the soul is going to be better off when it's experienced discipline, Callicles says, I have no notion what you're referring to, Socrates. Do ask someone else. And he goes on to say, well, he doesn't care. He only was answering in order to please Gorgias. And so he pretty much basically says Socrates can just go on by himself, and that's what happens.
It's so weird, isn't it?
That's right.
I think I've felt like Socrates at times. When everyone just goes, I'm not even paying attention anymore. I don't care. Say what you want.
Right. So in a sense, but isn't that demonstrating that Callicles doesn't have the courage of his convictions? Isn't that because he just can't be bothered to defend them in the end? And maybe that's a sign that they're not actually that strong, or he really can't defend them, because he just gives up. And basically I think we also ought to, and this is something I probably should have mentioned last time, is to remind us that they're in Callicles' house here. So he's actually the host. So
okay.
The fact that he's getting a bit cheesed off is maybe significant. But anyway, of course, go ahead.
In the Greek world, I was curious. I guess the host has a kind of responsibility to humor his visitors. He can't just go, get out, bugger off. Not easily anyway, right?
Well, that's right, especially when he's got the great Gorgias staying with him. You know, he's kind of he maybe feels he's been a bit set up here. But anyway, look, Socrates doesn't mind about carrying both sides of the discussion on by himself. He's quite up to it.
You can really see him as this awkward kind of party goer, isn't he? Because everyone's like, look, enough. And he's just like, well, I'll keep going.
That's right. He's quite happy about it. And in fact, he gives quite a, again, we come back to this issue of giving a big speech, giving a little speech. Well, Socrates gives another quite a big speech when Callicles just gives up. So he says, and I'm going to be reading the English of the Louvre here, so it's not quite the same as the PDF, but so that in Epicharmus's phrase, what two men spake erewhile, I may prove I can manage single-handed. And indeed it looks as though it must of sheer necessity be so. Still, if we are to do this, for my part, I think we ought all to vie with each other in attempting a knowledge of what is true and what is false in the matter of our argument. For it is a benefit to all alike that it be revealed. So he's reinforcing there that, well, Callicles may have given up, but ultimately they're going to arrive at a position of what's true and what's not, or what's not true. And so that's going to be of benefit to everyone involved. It's not just a matter of personal status, or he's not trying to gain a personal benefit from it, but it's to do with finding out what is correct and what isn't.
Yeah, and the start to that, where Callicles kind of leaves the conversation, Socrates offers a really, really nice summary of everything so far between him and Callicles, right? I think that's a really neat little summary.
Yeah, it is. It's quite a good recap. So I'm just changing pages in the Greek, which takes a minute.
I'm going to resist looking at the PDF because that's what happens. It just, my computer obviously doesn't have the processing power. Anyway.
Yeah, but fair enough. So in fact, Socrates would have been happy to, well, in fact, Gorgias butts in and says, look, he's happy to continue, and he's happy to hear Socrates go through the rest himself. But everyone's happy for Socrates just to go on. So he gives a bit of a recap. So they'd already established that the pleasant and the good are not the same thing. And finally, the virtue of each thing, whether it's an implement or of a body or a soul or anything living, doesn't just come about by accident, but by order or regulation or some kind of craft. It's not going to happen just by chance. And so he comes to his conclusion about the soul, that a soul which has its proper order is going to be better than one which is unordered. So the temperate soul, so that's the self-controlled soul, is going to be better off.
Yes.
And the self-controlled, sorry, the well-ordered soul will be self-controlled. And it'll be ordered, Herdige Cosmios Orphon. It will be controlled in accordance with order. And the self-controlled soul will do what is appropriate, and the Greek is prosekonta, for both gods and humans. And you raised the point in the Facebook, Courtney, about how useful the Gorgias is for later Stoic theory. And I think this is one aspect where it certainly is, about appropriate action being intimately connected with virtue. I think this is one of those key passages.
And that passage where he starts with self-control shows how self-control is linked to all the virtues, because then he talks about how you have to have bravery as well, and all these other virtues kind of flow out of this self-control, this ordered soul. Yeah,
and I mean, that's something I've always considered, is that self-control is like the key that allows people to acquire, or at least attempt to move towards acquiring, all the others. You know, when a young child goes into school, they need to have learned enough self-control to sit on the floor and listen to the teacher at a very minimum, and enough self-control to not burst out talking to their friends all the time. That self-control is the key virtue that allows them to learn and to gradually develop as people. It's so important.
It's such an interesting issue too, because, you know, I spent a fair chunk of my youth being a bit of a hedonist. So I would say that I was lacking in self-control. But it's more than that. I wasn't interested in self-control. I thought things would just work out if you just threw caution to the wind. Most of the time it does, you'd be surprised. But it raises the question, like, on the other hand, even though I was I'm not sure. Like, I was open to whatever experience would happen. On the other hand, I was never lacking in some other more fundamental form of self-control. Like, I didn't burst into tears spontaneously. I never was the kind of person who suddenly become angry and things like that. So it makes me wonder what kind of things he specifically means when we're talking about self-control. Obviously, there's an ethical dimension that gets raised here. We might even say a psychological kind of form of self-control, because you're going to meet other people who advocate for different spiritual systems that will say something like in Buddhism or Epicureanism about being in the moment or something, or letting things happen, or a different kind of, that's self-control versus control of things around you kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think for the Greeks it probably covered everything. So I think it was pretty all covering. So, and this is something I learned when I was researching it many years ago. So the actual etymology of the Greek word used here in Plato, sophron, is related to the words to save or to preserve, and that source, phren, which is it's actually your insides. So it's related to preserving yourself in the core. And so that's really interesting, I think. And it's not something we think about, but it kind of indicates that there's this very visceral nature to it. You know, it's not necessarily just cognitive or intellectual. It's to do with your very being, your very core. So that's something to think about as well.
That is interesting, because I often think how at least my understanding of Stoicism would map onto this. And I think my understanding is that, you know, they have that distinction between what is up to us versus what is not up to us. And they want us to focus as our area of concern on what is up to us. And what is up to us, in a sense, is our core. And the core is the rational part, or the hegemonikon. So that fits with that kind of idea, because it's self-control in the sense that I am only the thing, or concerned about the thing that I have control over, which is that thing, the rational being.
Exactly. It's preserving that core.
And it's an interesting, if you take and Socrates and Stoics share that internal volitionist kind of perspective. If you stay in that self-controlled core, that rational part, then the rest kind of takes care of itself, because appropriate action naturally follows from the appropriate use of what's within your power, which is that in this text it's called self-control, and everything emanates out from that.
And I think that may get lost in translation sometimes, because people, again, this comes back to this attitude we have about our emotions, and in our culture, you know, people think, oh, self-control means you're repressing your emotions, but well, actually not exactly. It's a positive thing, not a negative thing. It's a preserving, not a suppressing.
That was the point I was making on that other post, is that if we have a modern concept of willing, then self-control is a forceful experience. It's something that you apply to yourself. But if we think in terms of this internal volitionism, you know, this kind of idea that just being in that part, the rational core, which is up to you, that in itself is the activity of self-control. And from there, all of your activity kind of emanates from that particular point of view. It's different. It's a different form of willing. And as you know, obviously, will as we know it now doesn't come along until another, I don't know, 600 or 700 years later or something.
Exactly. No, it's very interesting to see it kind of in these formative phases in Plato. And so I think what Socrates starts to do here is he's sketching out the way in which the virtues are connected. So he says, when the person who's self-controlled does what is fitting as regards men, his actions will be just, and as regards the gods, they will be pious. And he who does what is just and pious must needs be a just and pious man. That is so, because obviously he doesn't need Callicles to agree with him anymore. He's just going to agree with himself. And surely he must be brave also, for you know a sound or temperate mind. I'm just looking at the Greek there. Is shown not by pursuing and shunning what one ought not, but by shunning and pursuing what one ought, whether they be things or people or pains, and by steadfastly persevering in one's duty, so that it follows of strict necessity. So yes, he's saying, uga de sophros andros estin uta diocain. So yeah, the really self-controlled person, the truly and genuinely self-controlled person, will not avoid what's appropriate. They won't. They'll be drawn to doing what is appropriate.
Mm.
And again,
It's
that's absolutely key for subsequent theory. Sorry, Courtney, go on.
Oh no, I always marvel at this because it's the same in the Stoics. It's like, you know, if it's natural to act that way, then why is it that so many of us kind of are bewitched by the senses and act contrary to nature in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about that for some time. That would be a whole different session.
Yes, but in a way, that's what's going on in the background.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely
Callicles is saying, well, obviously, it's better to get what you want, and he's saying, no, it's not. It's better to pay what's due.
Yeah, actually, sidebar. Just so I joined a Nietzschean Facebook group, and yeah, somebody there was posting absolutely about the Gorgias and saying, well, you know, Callicles was right. Alcibiades was one of the strong people who, but ultimately he was brought down by the inferior people in the democracy, and you know that's why democracy's bad or whatever. And but kind of missing the point that Socrates has made all along, that well, who is the stronger person? If Alcibiades or anyone else hasn't overcome their desires, then they're not strong. They're not the stronger person. They're not the superior person. They're just the, you know, the marvelous waste of talent that was Alcibiades or whoever.
Yes. And it stems from the physics, really, doesn't it? Because the Nietzschean idea, I think, is that nature is amoral and just is this whirling kind of will to power, this kind of irrepressible force. And so should we be if we have the capacity to be so. So there's no like good or bad in that picture. It's just like it's just a black hole.
But what I was surprised about was, I would have thought that if you read the Gorgias attentively, you see that Socrates shows that the strong person or the superior person, well, what does that really mean? You know, if a person is not superior in virtue, then they're not superior at all. They might be more intelligent than the next person, but they're not stronger and they're not superior.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, a lot of philosophers, I guess, will come down on the side that, well, you know, at the end of the day, if we respect reality, we'll realize that we're finite beings. So no one's really powerful at all because we all die. You can have $1 billion in your bank account. What's the difference? When you die and the poor man next to you dies, you're equal. You have the same status. And I think Socrates makes the point of that towards the end of this dialogue, doesn't he? Where he talks about the judges, the sons of Zeus and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, we won't jump ahead to that quite yet. But anyway, so Socrates is still going on with his big speech here. So he says, so there is my account of the matter. He who does well is blessed and happy, while the wicked man or evildoer is wretched. And this must be the man who is an opposite case to the self-controlled man, the licentious man, the akolastos, the undisciplined man, whom you were commending. That's Callicles. So he says, Socrates goes on to say, everyone should flee from lack of self-control, from akolasia. But if someone does offend, then right must be applied and he must be corrected if they are to be happy. So this, in my opinion, is the mark on which a man should fix his eyes throughout life. He should concentrate all his own and his city's efforts on this one business of providing a man who would be blessed with the needful justice and temperance, or self-control, not letting one's desires go unrestrained and in one's attempts to satisfy them, and interminable trouble leading to the life of a robber. So yeah, that's the point I made earlier, that the person who is trying to satisfy their desires and nothing else is outside society, because they're going to essentially be equivalent to a criminal. That's if they're not actually being a criminal and robbing people, as someone who, in the grip of an obsession or a desire or an addiction, is likely to do.
Yeah.
Even if they're robbing their own family or whatever, as someone who's someone with a family who is spending all their money at the pokies or whatever, they're still robbing family and robbing society.
There's a point just before there, I think. I can't see the PDF, but I'm just going off memory. But I remember him saying that we all, because we're concerned with being better, we have to, if we want to be better, we have to be open about it or something. Is that just prior to that bit? We have to basically inform on each other. That was the vibe I was getting from the text.
I think that's a bit later on. That was quite interesting. Okay. Yeah.
When you get to that, let me know, because I checked in Nussbaum's Therapy of Desire, and because it reminded me of the Epicureans, and sure enough, there's a section there where I think Epicurus really takes that to another level in his garden, in his community, because there's this idea in there that Nussbaum says that Epicurus invents the unconscious, or discovers it, because basically saying, we can't even trust that we can really confess everything, that there's stuff like beliefs that are so deeply stored that the master has to analyze your dreams and kind of get you to confess fully all of your kind of beliefs about things. But I don't want to jump ahead, but I was interested because Socrates goes in a very interesting direction there, because you can see how the church takes it up too. So we can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah. So I think that comes up shortly, but I just wanted to draw attention to. So Socrates says, just after this bit about the armed robber, he says, self-control and justice hold communities together, and that's, I think, obviously true. And that's why the whole is called a cosmos, not a chaos, akosmia, or a free-for-all, which is akalasia. And Socrates, being the only orator here, takes the opportunity to point out that Callicles had ignored the importance of proportion and equality among men, the principle of justice. And he says that you consider that greed should be practiced because you ignore geometry. Now, it's tongue-in-cheek, but Socrates is grounding the ethic of equality in mathematics, which is really interesting, I think.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to, as you say, Courtney, this idea of making accusations against oneself or against a friend if the wrong thing is done. Becoming an informer, essentially, against either oneself or someone close to one.
It's an interesting point, because it kind of makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Can you imagine, Socrates' perfect city where everyone's dobbing on each other all the time?
Well, that's right. But then if it was his perfect city, then no one would need to, because everyone would be self-controlled and do the right thing.
But just to quote from this book on the where it comes up with Epicurus, that is fine on the surface, but as he says here, it says, talking about Epicurus and this informing idea, part of the idea is that you know, if Socrates is right that we can get to the bottom of things through dialectic, then that's fine. But Epicurus is going to say, well, some things are actually hidden, so we have to then drill down and do this kind of psychoanalysis, if you like, to really pull out the hidden stuff, hidden even from the person. And so there's a quote here. It says, it's from I'm not sure the source. It's anyway something that refers to. I think it's from the Creation. No, it's not. It's no. Anyway. I'll just read it. It says, the next fragment continues the saga. For if a person, and this is a quote from Epicurus, for if a person desires his friend to attain correction, Epicurus will not consider him a slanderer when he is not this. He will consider him a person who loves his friend, for he knows the difference well. So that's the idea, that the person who dobs on his friend is actually a good friend, you know, the one who's brought him for treatment. And the context here in Therapy of Desire is that he sees it as the master is playing the role of the doctor, just like Socrates talks about, and that you can't escape. Yeah, basically, he's going to get his hands on you and sort of psychoanalyze you and force you to spill all the beans and get all your secrets out on the table. This kind of idea. Scary, because you know, imagine that in the hands of a government or something like that.
Well, I mean, and you can see why, you know, the Epicureans came across as this proto-cult, essentially. And, you know, their rivals were constantly saying, well, you're just a cult. You're not a philosophical school. You know, you're just kind of a personality cult. So yes, it's interesting, but you're probably right. They probably did borrow this from Socrates, I would say.
And I wondered how much. I just wondered how much it. I know we don't know the answer to this, but I wonder how much it influenced the church. Maybe not at all, but this idea. You know, I was listening to a show on the Inquisition, and they were saying that the person who was a heretic owed something to God, and he had to pay it back to God, and that was the idea of penance. It wasn't that they were paying the church back directly, it's that they'd had done something against God and that it was appropriate to pay it back, which is very similar to what Socrates is talking about here.
Yeah, I haven't listened to that clip you posted in Facebook yet, Courtney, so I can't really comment specifically on that, but I mean, it may well be, because, you know, there was a big Platonist strand in early Christianity, as we know, so that may be something that they inherited from this dialogue. It's quite possible.
It's interesting to consider these things, because we have a tendency to be very, very generous towards Plato and Socrates. I mean, I feel like I think, you know, it's amazing, like Socrates is a bit of an idol, but on the other hand, when you think, well, I wonder if the church got these, you know, suddenly the flavor is what could happen with some of these ideas. It can be quite frightening how it might be used in the hands of a power that wants to, I don't know, manage and control the people or whatever.
Yeah, and Socrates' irony, I'm sure, would have got lost in translation. You know, he may not actually have been quite suggesting that friends should go and report on each other at every opportunity, but that might have been expediently how it was interpreted.
If his opponent was a better cross-examiner, though, that's exactly the line he might have taken. He would have said something like, so what do you mean, Socrates? If your friend really cares about you, that means he's going to dob you into the judge and get you in trouble so that you'll pay back what is due. And Socrates would be like, yeah, I guess so.
100%, because that's what happened. Sorry. So And this, of course, brings Socrates to his point, which is, well, is it fairly alleged or not that I am unable to stand up for myself or for any of my friends and relations, or to deliver them from the sorest perils, but am exposed like an outcast to the whim of anyone who chooses to give me the dashing phrase is yours, a box on the ears? Because this is, remember what Callicles brought up, people like Socrates are just worthy to suffer violence or to get hit, because that's the kind of thought process that Callicles has. And Socrates hones back in on that. But then, Socrates turns that on his head. He says, I deny, Callicles, that to be wrongfully boxed on the ear is the deepest disgrace, or to have either my person cut or my purse. The translator's making a rather clumsy little pun there. I hold that to strike or cut me or mine wrongfully is yet more of a disgrace and an evil. So this is the key point in this speech, that to do the wrong thing to Socrates or to someone who has done nothing wrong, to do wrong unjustly is worse than to suffer wrong unjustly.
Yeah. It means that a wicked man is doing harm to a good man.
Yeah. And that's, perhaps the most, the key takeaway, I guess, from this part of the dialogue. But Socrates he gets quite carried away with his own rhetoric in this speech, I think. So he says, all this, which has been made evident on the lines I have stated some way back in our foregoing discussion, is held firm and fastened, if I may put it rather bluntly, with reasons of steel and adamant. So it would seem, at least on the face of it, which you or somebody more gallant than yourself must undo. That's a reference to the fact Callicles couldn't even bother to stick up for his position, or else find you cannot make a right statement in terms other than I now use. And so it's injustice that is the greatest of evils to the wrongdoer. And so the wrongdoer should pay a penalty.
Thinking about the dialectic, and I think Long's, I'm sure he didn't come up with this distinction, but there's the idea of the elenchus and the protreptic. I think because Socrates is forced not to be able to do the elenchus, which is to cross-examine the opponent, he's doing a lot more protreptic in these long speeches. So
that's a good idea. Yes,
he's doing this moral exhortation now.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So the Gorgias gets to show off the different approaches in the dialectic.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. So then he suggests that, well, what power should a man have in order to protect himself against suffering wrong or doing wrong? Well, obviously, the way you protect yourself against both suffering wrong and doing wrong is not to do wrong as far as possible. And then we have the interesting example about, well, should one protect oneself by aligning with a tyrant? Say you've got a drug lord operating in your community. Should you align yourself with that person and try to curry favor with that person, because then you'll be protected? Someone like Callicles would say, yeah, you should do that, because that's the way to ensure protection for yourself. But Socrates says, no, it's not a great policy, and a man who does that is going to have his soul mutilated because he's imitated an unjust person. And then interestingly,
because that idea of self-protection that you were talking about there is to not do wrong by men and gods. It's piety and justice, isn't it? That was exactly what concerns it. So that's why, you would definitely not try to mimic somebody who's going to lead you astray from that sort of self-protection, that thing that you can kind of keep you safe throughout your life. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, And actually, Socrates even says specifically, it's about what young men in the city should reflect upon. So he knows that young men are particularly vulnerable to picking the wrong kind of role model here.
Yeah.
You know, someone who they're particularly vulnerable to seeing someone who, yeah, makes a great splash in the criminal or semi-criminal community as a role model.
Yes, it makes sense because I was rereading that Foucault, Technologies of the Self, before, because it always comes to mind when you're reading Plato, and he was saying that about politics and education, and that for Plato, philosophy was also concerned with the youth of the city. And it makes sense too, I guess, because they're going to be the future leaders, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's much better to focus on the young people than the old people who are already set in their ways and established, because these young guys they're going to be the politicians and the orators and the leaders. He's
Yeah.
not talking about slaves. They're not the people he's hanging out with.
No, that's right. So yes, someone who goes in for some kind of bad role model like that is going to find their soul damaged, essentially. And but Callicles still doesn't want to hear it. He says, "You have a strange way of twisting your arguments at each point, this way or that, Socrates. Surely you know that this imitator, so this young person who's imitating the bad role model, will put to death anyone who does not imitate his master if he pleases, and will strip him of his property." So Callicles seems to think that's okay. Sorry, my computer's kind of slowed down. There we go. Okay, so then Socrates kind of changes tack and he starts to talk about skills which can save lives. So sometimes if you know how to swim, well, that's going to save your life. Also, if you know how to pilot a boat, sometimes that could save your life as well. But boat pilots or engineers, bridge builders, that don't go around boasting about their achievements because, you know, even though they can save lives, sometimes, well, maybe sometimes the people whose lives they save would rather not be living, or maybe they're not good people, or so preservation of life in itself is not necessarily such a good thing, but studying the best way to live is. And Socrates points out that Callicles is at the mercy of the demos, the people that he likes to cultivate, the ones he's trying to please.
You know, talking about the swimming, I know it was only a tiny little thing, but I was listening to the radio the other day, ABC or whatever, and there was a PhD lady who was studying the history of swimming or something, and she mentioned that line from Plato. Yeah, but her reading was really weird because she was actually coming to it from an anthropologist who was interested in the ways in which swimming were used, as either aristocrats used to swim but slaves didn't, like she mentioned that. So she was saying the only kind, what she said was, and this is quite interesting, that human beings are one of the few mammals that don't naturally swim. So like if you put a human being in water and they haven't learned to swim, so it's a knowledge, they actually drown. So you can't, what she was saying is you can't fake the knowledge of swimming. If someone says, I know how to swim, the best way to find out is just shove them in the water. So there's something hidden there, I reckon, too, you know, because it's a kind of knowledge that you can't fake.
That's right. Well, is it a episteme or a empiria? Is it a knack? Is it a techne or a knack? You know, that's really interesting. I don't know. I think it's a well, I think you'd have to say it's an empiria because you learn it by doing it.
Probably. But the interesting thing is maybe like I can imagine a scenario where someone is you're probably right. It's not. It wouldn't fall into the category of the name. I'm just thinking. You could imagine some smart con man who's like, "Yeah, I know how to do that. I know how to do everything," and he tricks everyone all along. But something like swimming or maybe even fixing a car. Yeah, you're right. It would have to be learnt through experience, because without that experience, you just can't possibly pull it off.
Yeah, exactly.
But interesting how the lady on Radio National went on and on about that little line for about 30 minutes. And then when I found it, I was like, I don't know how she milked like that much out of it for a PhD. Like,
That's right. There's a whole dialogue there, you know.
yeah. But
Oh,
anyway, got me
goodness.
thinking about it.
So,
But that point you're making about the boat, right? He says, even though the guy who drives the boat saves lives or preserves lives because they didn't die when, you know, he didn't crash the boat, sort of thing, he actually hasn't necessarily done people any good. That's a really weird argument, because what he's saying is there's some people on the boat who might have had a terminal illness or something and might not have even had any reason to live. So when he got them to the other side and got them there in a manner that they weren't dead, well, he actually didn't do them any good, because they
yeah,
probably would have been better off dead.
it's a very weird argument, and he kind of doesn't actually go anywhere with it. You know, it's kind of in passing.
Yeah.
Except that it allows him to basically say that these things, you know, can have good outcomes and bad outcomes, essentially.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, though. Like, he's also saying, so even if you have the kind of ability or knowledge to save people's lives or get them from A to B safely, that's not really good enough. That's not really what is admirable about these knowledges. There's something else going on about making them better. I think it's not
I
about
think you're right,
preserving
Courtney.
life.
Yeah, and he says that's why boat pilots and engineers don't go around, you know, congratulating themselves. And that's true, they don't. That essentially, yeah, they've got a job to do, but ultimately the outcome they kind of don't necessarily have any influence over. So what does he go on there? Oh yeah, so that was really interesting. So then he goes on to point out, and this, because he's kind of got the floor exclusively, he can hone in on Callicles's you know, prejudices. So he points out that, you know, you, Callicles, don't think much of these engineers, and you wouldn't let your daughter marry one, and or you wouldn't want your son to become one, because you're a snob, essentially. And that's where our friend from the Nietzsche group is also a snob. You know, he loves Alcibiades because he's a good-looking aristocrat. He doesn't really value any other skilled kind of person. Essentially, that's what Socrates manages to get a hit in on Callicles here. But again, that allows him to seg to this key issue. You know, what does better mean? What is a superior person? But if better has not the meaning I give it, but virtue means just saving oneself and one's belongings, whatever one's character may be, you are merely ridiculous in cavilling or objecting at the engineer and the doctor and every other art that has been produced for our safety. No, my gifted friend, he says, or Macarie, you blessed person, you may find that the noble and the good are something different from saving and being saved.
Yeah, so you were right on the money. Yeah, it's not good enough to save someone's body or their possessions. You have to save their soul.
Yeah. And so Callicles, because he is, again, we come back to this issue of he's in love with the demos, which is the name of a particular young person, but it's also the Athenian people. And so he's committed to pleasing them, whatever they want. And we know that the wishes of a people, a community, can be all over the place. You know, one day they want something, the next day they want something else. Interestingly, though, Callicles pipes up finally and he says, it seems to me, I cannot tell how that your statement is right, Socrates, but I share the common feeling. I do not quite believe you. And he said, in the Greek, it says, "Opanosoi pesomai." I'm not quite convinced by you. I'm not quite influenced by you. He doesn't find Socrates particularly persuasive here.
You get the impression he doesn't find him persuasive at all throughout. But maybe there's something going on in particular here, do you think?
Yeah, so Socrates thinks it's the love of demos, the love of, whether that's the people of Athens or this particular young man he's talking about. So the thing about appealing to the people is they don't want to, if there's a speech tailored to, they want things specially tailored to them. They don't care about things tailored for other people.
Mm.
And that's actually a really kind of insightful point, I think, about democracy, is that, and we see it with populist politicians all over the place. They like to identify with the local people. They put on the colors of the particular football team or whatever in order to say they're one of those people. They want to identify with the crowd to polish their populist credentials. So I think I think Socrates was right on the money about what's involved in trying to appeal to the people.
Yeah, a lot of it's really spot on, because he says you're treating the people like children, basically. And I think he uses that example. Maybe it's coming up about imagine what it'd be like if a baker kind of was prosecuting me or whatever. Is that coming up? And the witnesses or whatever, the jurors, were children.
I think it is, yeah. And whether that's right. Whether we'd ever erected a building for one of our friends, or whether such a building was handsome or ugly. And these are kind of the things that are taken into account. Oh yeah, that's right. And whether Socrates, and he also makes the important point about appealing to the public like that. Let us say now, in heaven's name, how does Socrates himself stand as regards his body's health? If you're going to go out there and talk about improving people's health, well, people are going to look at you and say, well, are you healthy? And they're going to look at your record. They're going to look at your credentials. And he also makes an interesting point about it would be foolish for someone who was inexperienced to try and undertake some kind of big government contract. Starting some kind of public practice themselves without being experienced in it, without having adequate training. And so this is all to do with this idea of how do we assess people's credentials in being a public figure or providing a public service. We look at their record. We look at whether they are credible, I suppose, is what we would say now. And it gets Callicles to agree it would be silly for someone who had no experience to try and undertake a big contract. Excuse me. And then this allows Socrates to come back to this point about whether a public speaker has made people worse or better. We have to look at their record in that respect. What about people like Miltiades and Pericles and Cimon and Themistocles? Did they make the Athenian people better or worse as a result of their public speaking?
This is interesting because I didn't know much about the history, and I assumed that Pericles was a wonderful guy, but Socrates kind of pointing out that he thinks that Pericles is not really such a wonderful guy, despite what the occasional person like Callicles says about him.
Yeah, it was really interesting, isn't it? And um, Socrates points out that well, there's some people around the place say, well, Pericles made things worse because he introduced payment for public offices, or undertaking public responsibilities. So maybe he made the Athenian people more lazy and dependent on welfare dependent, we might say these days. And these are really kind of current issues. These issues haven't gone away. These ideas around whether payment for public roles is adequate or not. I think it's so interesting that Socrates is canvassing these issues, um, and canvassing them in terms of, well, what does it do to sort of the character of a people en masse? What are the results of these kind of policy decisions? Do they make things better or do they make things worse?
It also shows that he's a bit of an iconoclast. There's nothing really sacred in a sense for Socrates. I mean, there is obviously in the background the gods and that, but he doesn't, what's the word, submit to any kind of recognition of that this guy is a cultural icon, for example.
Yeah, exactly. There's no sacred cows for for Socrates.
And I think that's part of the reason he gets into so much trouble later on, right?
Yeah, 100%. And so what was interesting too with that was that Socrates says, well, what I, for my part, hear is that Pericles has made the Athenians idle, cowardly, talkative, and avaricious by starting the system of public fees. But Callicles says, you hear that from the folk with the battered ears, Socrates. Now, I'm not sure if this was in the PDF notes, but in the Learned notes it says that that's a reference to pro-Spartan people. So the people with the battered ears are the Spartans who love engaging in physical contact. So it's like, he's saying, Callicles is saying, oh, well, the only people who would say that about Pericles are pro-Spartans. It's just like, people say nowadays, oh, well, if you say that, well, you must be a Trump supporter or you must be a Albanese supporter or whatever. It's like going straight to the kind of the political angle. That's what Callicles does here, which was really interesting, I thought. So Callicles finally challenges that. Well, and sorry, Socrates points out, well, Pericles was charged with embezzlement. A lot of people thought he'd done the wrong thing. So does that mean he was a bad man? Callicles asks. Well, Socrates points out, well, what are we to think about the way he left the Athenian people, who seem to have been quite volatile in their reactions? They're like a bit like, domestic animals. They've become wilder and more volatile. And what about Miltiades? He was sentenced. Themistocles was exiled. But interestingly, Socrates doesn't blame these great men of the past. He thinks they did the best they could.
Yeah, you can see, because I commented on this before, that what he's saying is, if they really were making the people better, then the people wouldn't have unjustly turned upon them, because they would have the virtue of justice, because they would have been made better by this man.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really key point that you drew attention to there. And it gets you thinking about, how we treat our elected representatives today. We do kind of we do condemn them basically for X, Y, and Z. And they, again, as Plato suggests, they turn around and complain of their unjust treatment from the people. It's as if nothing's changed in that regard. It seems to be a mutually kind of accusing relationship.
It's a really interesting point too, because it makes you think, and I usually stay out of politics, but it makes you think, does the public servant say to himself, my job is just to run these programs and deliver these, what do you call them, policies or whatever? Or am I really doing these things because I believe it will better the people? And the question is, if it's the second one, that he's not just a cog in the machine, but he thinks that he's bettering the people, well, then he's putting himself in this position that Socrates is talking about, that he's getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to do this job, but is he really bettering the people? Possibly he's doing a job doing service delivery, so then he's just like the guy driving the boat or the engineer or whatever. So don't think yourself better than anybody else. You know, you're the same as the bricklayer. All you're doing is a service. But if you think you're bettering the people, well, then you can hardly complain when they turn against you, because it just proves that you haven't bettered the people.
Yeah, exactly. And but that also raises the bigger question: is the people ever going to be bettered? You know, is the people capable of being bettered? And that's what what citizens of democracies probably need to think about is
that's right.
Is the problem us? And the conclusion is, I think, inevitably yes, the problem is us. The problem is human nature, which is to blame the people who have led us in a direction that we then turn against. I think, you know, Socrates is perhaps, you know, Socrates is kind of consistently generous to the people in the sense that he doesn't, he accept, and I think, again, this goes through to the Stoics, you know, the acceptance of people are going to act irrationally or ungratefully or in one way or another not proportionally to what's gone before. That's just how it is.
Yeah, it's definitely unclear if you can teach the people how to be better. But on the other hand, pedagogy is in the background here. So part of it is, even though we don't know that we might be able to make the people better, we can at least try to educate them the best we can with the best principles, in the hope that some of them might become better.
Yeah.
So that's always there. And in fact, Epictetus picks that one up from the Socratic, you know, from that kind of vibe, because he says, you know, people are just ignorant. Don't get angry at somebody because they've offended you. Instead, show them why they've gone wrong. And if you can't show them what they've done wrong, well, then you might as well just blame yourself. You know, so
yeah, absolutely.
But it does also raise the other problem, like we're focusing on whether you can actually teach the people anything to be better. But also the other question is, well, what is the person doing who thinks that they're making the people better in order to justify the massive amounts of money and prestige and status they get? Is it, if they're not actually achieving that task of bettering the people, then should they really get paid as much as they do, or are they just some sort of fancy service delivery technician?
Yeah, well, I think that's a bigger question than the Gorgias, but yes, it brings us to the whole rationale of public office and government in a democracy, which is probably bigger than our pay grade at the moment, Courtney.
But it comes up in this because he says something like, when you go about making a person better, you shouldn't get paid for that. In fact, it would be shameful to expect payment. Yeah. And so, but if you were building a house, you know, which is a different craft, then, and that's fine, you can get paid for that. He has this sort of distinction. Yeah. And he says, it's got to do with this idea that when you better another person, they reciprocate and they will better you. And I guess presumably that means you've got people bettering each other and making a harmonious society. And that should be free, which raises the question, of course, that all of those kinds of helping professions, we call them, that seek to improve or better people, how do they justify charging money for it? And obviously psychology is one of those ones. And it is a really thorny issue because the people who need it most are the poorest. Yet psychologists cost hundreds of dollars an hour to employ.
Yeah, it is a really thorny issue.
And they know it. You talk to psychologists about it, and they're really torn about it. They're like, I really want to help poor people, but I need to pay the mortgage, and I've got $100,000 HEX bill and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a real problem. I think he's really onto something there, though.
Of course he is. He's totally onto something. So I thought it was interesting how, after giving the examples of Pericles and Miltiades, Socrates says he doesn't blame anyone, any of the leaders from that time. And in fact, he thinks people from those former times are actually probably doing a better job than the ones they have today. But even so, they were all engaged in flattering the people, essentially. So what is involved in sort of improving the soul of the people? And Socrates then kind of tries to turn to that. And he reverts to these ideas which were raised earlier in the dialogue around what a doctor does and a nutritionist, essentially, or a physical trainer. They're bringing excellence to the body. But and then he gives the rather amusing example of the baker, Thearion, Mathicus, the author of the book on Sicilian cookery, Sarambus, the wine growing guy. Well, they've all done their bit for the Athenian people, but really, what's the absolute result? What's the result? Well, people have got a bit fatter and more choosy about wine. That's the net result. So what's been the net result of great public figures like Pericles and so on? What's been the net result? And it's probably not that promising. We've got people who are pretty ungrateful about it, and they protest, and everyone protests, the politicians protest. And what have the sophists done? Well, the sophists, who've claimed to be teachers of virtue, have then turned around and complain when their pupils and their students don't pay them. Well, hang on, how could that be? Surely if they've done their job, then their students would know to pay them and would have been conscious of that responsibility. So how could that be that they haven't achieved their purpose?
That's right. And this is funny, isn't it, really? Because it's an issue that comes up for us in the Stoic community, is all the people who want to get into, and I'm kind of one of those people in a sort of way, that want to toy with the idea of coaching Stoicism or using it in psychotherapy or something like that. At some point, people are going to want to turn that into a money-making experience for them, where they go, oh, I've improved you now, hand over the dosh, sort of thing. And that's a really tricky one. And I think this is the kind of thing that Socrates is talking about too.
Yeah.
I wonder, did Epictetus charge people money to come to his school?
I think he probably would have. I mean, I think when we read that he had a school, I think that means that people paid to go along. So yes, I would say so. But yeah, it's a really tricky one. And I mean, you know my position on it. And I'm kind of with Socrates, but at the same time, and partly because if you decide that it's something to charge money for, then you get into credentialism. Oh, well, what are your credentials? Or what are that person's credentials? Oh, they've got a PhD, or they haven't got a PhD, or they're acquainted with the ancient languages, they're not acquainted with the ancient languages. It becomes a competition, and that brings in kind of comparisons that are odious, as the old expression says. So,
well, and they all fit with this kind of flattery, right? Because obviously Socrates doesn't have any credentials. He doesn't have a PhD. He just has a kind of character.
Yeah.
And that's what he's saying. All you other people, you acting as if There's a lot of snobbery around your credentials and who you know and who your family is and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean at the end of the day?
And this brings me to what we might do for our next dialogue, which is the euthydemus, which is partly around, some more of these sophists who charge people for essentially, as it turns out, engaging in wordplay and silly kind of, argumentation for the sake of it, not actually improving people in their lives at all. So this is something I think that was key to Plato's preoccupations around what Socrates was trying to do.
And it comes up in the critical psych school stuff again, because people who know this will often attack the psychologists for this exact sort of behavior and say, what's the difference between a psychologist and a sophist? It's a difficult one to work out whether you actually help people or not. And they have to create sophisticated measures, assessment tools and stuff in order to show that they've been beneficial. But of course, the tools that are developed usually are developed by psychologists to show some sort of effect in the first place. So it's really complex territory to know whether you're actually helping a person or whether you're just fitting them back into the status quo. That'd be one way of looking at it. Or whether you're just returning them back to some sort of normative productivity so they can go back to work. Wouldn't the goal to be something more Socratic, to help the person become better, whatever that means?
Yeah.
It's very depressing when we start having this conversation.
Well, I mean, a kind of an interesting analog is something that I've been looking into from the Jane Austen side of things, which is around what clergy in 200 years ago were how they were placed, and yet that they were charged with the cure of souls, essentially to provide a spiritual service to the people. And so their payment notionally came entirely from tithes, so a 10% of the community's product essentially. So I think this sort of awkwardness around the relationship between spiritual benefit and monetary payment of the person involved is it's not just, as I say, in the philosophical community or the psych community, it's also in the religious community as well. There's always been this kind of uneasiness around the relationship between benefiting the people you serve and actually getting paid for it, and how that's going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's exactly what Socrates is saying here. He's saying helping people or bettering people should be free, and we should all be doing it all the time to each other.
Yeah.
But and another thing is we've created this expert kind of culture in which certain people have the professional capacity to help others, whereas other people are incompetent. And it creates a system of dependency where normal people can't even help themselves. They're like, oh, I have to see a doctor, I've got a sniffly nose.
Yeah.
Or I feel a bit low, I better get a mental health care plan.
Or I've been in therapy for 20 years. Okay.
Exactly. It's scary. We just accept that some people know more about you than you know about yourself.
Yeah. I think we're at one on this, Courtney. So yeah, Socrates asked the hard questions. Is a person made better or worse by the intervention of someone like Pericles? Or by someone like the sophists? What are they doing in terms of the souls that are at their disposal?
Yeah, which is what we were just talking about.
Yeah. So And so Socrates recalls to what he was telling Polus, you know, sophist and orator, my estimable friend, are the same thing, or very much of a piece, as I was telling Polus. But you, in your ignorance, think the one thing, rhetoric, a very fine affair, and despise the other. Yet in reality, sophistic is a finer thing than rhetoric, by so much as legislation is finer than judicature, and gymnastic than medicine.
Yeah, I get the idea that one is preventative and the other one is what you treat after you've got
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's preventative versus curative. Good point. Yeah. And so he actually comes down to brass tacks and says, I always regarded public speakers and sophists as the only people who have no call to complain of the thing that they themselves educate, for its wickedness towards them, as otherwise they must be, in the same words, be also charging themselves with having been of no use to those whom they say they benefit. Is it not so? And they alone, I presume, could most likely afford to give away their services without fee if their words were true. So, yeah, if the sophists have actually achieved what they claim to achieve, then they could justifiably not charge at all. And in fact, Callicles seems quite happy to nod along at this point. He doesn't raise any objections.
It makes you wonder what he's actually doing. He's probably
that's right. He's checking
looking at his mates, checking his watch. Yeah.
Checking his feed by this time. He says, yeah, Socrates, whatever. But anyway, then they actually, so it was actually Socrates encourages him to actually speak up. And Socrates says, so it is to a flatterer's work, most noble sir, that you invite me. And then again refers to this idea that don't tell me again that that people should put me to death, or that I'm worthy of being abused. And Callicles says, well, it strikes me, Socrates, that you don't believe these troubles could actually befall you. But Socrates indicates he does. You know, he accepts that this could actually happen to him. He could find himself in front of the courts, but he's an honest person, so he doesn't fear that.
Yeah.
And maybe what he thinks is, you know, he thinks he is one of the few people in Athens who understands what the real art of statesmanship is about.
This is really interesting because I've never really heard or seen Socrates make bold claims about his own credentials, but here, maybe he does elsewhere, I can't remember, but here he definitely says, there's not been many like me.
That's right.
I might be the only one here at the moment, you know. I'm pretty special.
Yeah, but he's aware that the kind of things he's saying to the Athenian people, you know, that they should do this, this, and this for their spiritual health, is not going to make him popular. It's going to make him unpopular, in fact. And he says, you know, that's going to make an outcry. You know, they're going to get upset about that. And Callicles, says, yep, that's going to happen.
And you can see how this influences the later cynics, right? Because a few times he said, there hasn't been people do these kinds of speeches. It's just not done. And then I was thinking, what about the cynics? And then I remembered, well, they obviously came later. So they're obviously inspired by this.
Yeah, they took a leaf out of his book. That's right. And so this is really interesting, though. I think Callicles keeps making this point about that Socrates won't be able to defend himself in this situation, which, you know, maybe says something about Callicles' preoccupations, but Socrates isn't bothered. You know, he understands that he is likely to come afoul of the system at some point.
Yeah, and he sort of says, doesn't he, that as long as I don't kind of undermine my integrity and that, then I will die. You know, I can't remember the exact words, I'm not looking at it, but he's happy to die if that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, that's right. He comes right out and says it. And he's not, you know, Callicles is kind of essentially holding this threat above him, but Socrates is quite open about facing it. He doesn't fear that at all. And then he moves to this account of what's likely to happen in the next state of being. By Homer's account, he says Zeus, Poseidon, and Pluto have this role around judging who's the souls in the next world. And then there was a problem because some people were going to the right place, some people were going to the wrong place. And then Zeus said, right, he was going to fix all that and get everyone judged properly in the next world.
Because apparently he's talking about a time when people knew that they were going to die. So maybe it's some sort of golden age. And he's saying that their elders or the people around them would make the judgment. But unfortunately, they were judging their clothes and their handsome appearance and basically their physicality and their class and their position and power. And so they were sometimes sending them to hell or to heaven randomly based on subjective reasons. So
yeah, which is kind of funny in a way.
It's curious though. I mean, I don't know much about the backstory here, but is this the golden age or the there's a certain age where the gods and men walk the earth together or something? I don't know.
I think it's one account of the golden age. I think there's a few different accounts in the Greek tradition about it. But the idea that these end of life judges were judging on body alone, or the appearance with the clothes on, is quite funny, really, when you think about it.
Yeah, and so for his way to fix this was to make sure they didn't know when they were going to die. Then they kick the bucket and they lose their body, and then some special new person is able to look at the soul and look at the marks on the soul.
Yeah, that's right. And the idea being that someone who's been a habitual wrongdoer, such as the great king, remember he came up earlier, the great king of Persia, or Archelaus of Macedonia, that kind of person who's made a lifetime habit of doing the wrong thing, their soul is going to be somehow marked, mutilated, visible in some way that they have been wrongdoers. And they're going to be judged.
This is interesting too, isn't it? Because again, you can see the Stoics obviously have a similar idea that the shape of the soul gets distorted, distended, bent out of shape, and so it doesn't fit its natural pattern or shape. But also, again, too, the Christians have a very similar idea that doesn't matter what happens to you in life. Obviously, you do the things you do in order to earn favor in the next world, So,
yeah.
What do you think about this argument? I mean, it's one that I've often disliked in religion, but interesting that Socrates should finish with it, because it makes me wonder, or maybe even worry. I'm not too serious about my worry, but that this is his real reasons after all, and that everything else is just sort of tacked on to the fact that, oh well, I think I need to clean up my act for the afterworld because I don't want to be in hell, kind of thing.
It doesn't bother me in that sense. I mean, we do get a somewhat different account in the Phaedo. Did we read that? And then we read that another time, or we didn't?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. So, it seems to make sense when Socrates talks about it. But just as powerful, I think, is his account that justice and self-control ensure the proper functioning of society. That's just as important for us on a daily basis as what's going to come later on.
Yeah.
And certainly for in terms of what Callicles is suggesting, I think the day-to-day social fabric is just as important as what might come later. I think he's bringing out his big guns for the benefit of Callicles, but I don't think you need to bring out the big guns of the afterlife to make his argument solid around what's best for societies in this world.
Mm. It's interesting that the Stoics never went down that line. Because obviously they
Yeah.
could well have. I
Well,
wonder what. Yeah.
Yeah, I think because they had a different view of the cosmos, that things were going to kind of be recycled at the ekpyrosis anyway, that there wasn't this kind of Elysian field stuff going on. But I could be wrong about that. I probably need to think some more about it.
No, I think you're right, because there are various accounts, I think, in the Middle Stoic period. I think Posidonius, or it could be Panaetius, I can't remember, but he introduces this idea that the sage's soul, or the soul that was quite refined or in accord with nature, could persist some time after death, but that didn't seem to be really fleshed out prior to this move. And the idea is that it would live somewhere above the earth, floating in the air, and remain intact for some period of time. And presumably, if the soul was really, really pure, like the sage soul, it may even stay intact until the whatever it's called, the
Ekpyrosis, yeah. Well, yeah, that could be right, because now that I think about it, you've got Cicero in the Dream of Scipio, talking about, souls of the departed meeting above, and then you've got Seneca at the end of the Consolation of Marcia. He sketches this scene of Marcia's son meeting his grandfather, again in this kind of view from above, looking down on everything that is below. So yeah, I think there must have been room in the Stoic worldview for some kind of afterlife, at least in some form, for the virtuous in that sense.
Because it raises the question, in Stoicism at least, that what is the purpose of perfecting the soul? Obviously, there's that we're a living creature, and that it's growing, and it's going through changes, and it's going to be reborn at the end of and recycled, like you said. So is the point kind of that the more we complete our own part, our own, whatever you want to call it, rational experience, and that it sort of allows the greater living organism to grow more efficiently, or something like that? Do you know what I mean? Like, what's the actual point, in a sense?
Yeah, well, I think if you think about Marcus's point of worldview, the point is the cyclic, the cycle persisting and ongoing, and the departed or the deceased contributing to the next generation of the living. So I think for Marcus, it's the cycles, it's the cosmic cycles which are key. For Seneca, couldn't be quite sure. I'd have to think some more about that. And for Epictetus, again, he seems to avoid, dwelling on these more cosmic points of view, and focusing more on the day-to-day. But I'll have to give that a bit more thought as to what we think the long-term the long-term view is.
I guess it doesn't matter. It's just interesting when you come across these things in Plato and you think, oh, I wonder what the schools who followed him thought about that, and how they tried to incorporate it into their physics, for example.
Yeah. I'm just rereading Cicero's De Natura Deorum at the moment, so I'll be in a better position when I've finished it again to discuss that. because that, yeah, he gives the Epicurean, the academic skeptic, and Stoic viewpoints there in summary. So
oh wow. Another thing I've got to read. Good on you. Are you reading it in Latin?
I've got the Loeb, so I've got both.
Oh, lovely. Well done.
Yeah, so just thinking about these souls of coming to judgment. So Rhadamanthus judges some of them, and yeah, the great king and Archelaus are going to be found to have been unjust in their lives and done the wrong thing.
And Socrates makes the point, doesn't he, that it's more likely going to be the rich and powerful who are going to be the souls that are going to be found to be beyond rehabilitation.
Yes, and that's a really interesting idea, isn't it? That there are some that can improve and some that are beyond improvement. A very interesting idea.
And those ones go to some pretty shitty place in Tartarus, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
And it sounds miserable because he says in the version I was reading, at least, that their suffering will be profound and there'll be like, you know, a kind of an incentive or a disincentive to other souls not to do what they did, basically. So it sounds horribly medieval Christian style, like flames and torment for poor old, what's his name, the Persian king.
Yeah. Interestingly, Socrates also mentions the philosopher who doesn't want to hurt anybody, who just goes about his business, not bothering people, and that the judges will be struck with admiration and send that soul off to the islands of the blessed. So that's good, isn't it? That's what Socrates is hoping to meet.
You can also see again with the Nietzscheans when they meet this final part of the dialogue, they're going to be like, "Nah, that's it. I'm done with this. This is just Christianity all over."
Yeah, and so yeah, that what you mentioned, Courtney, is a very interesting idea that someone with more power has got greater power to do evil than someone who has less power. So someone like, I think he gives the example of Thersites. So Thersites in the Iliad is kind of a low-born person who is a bit of a troublemaker and just accuses people and causes trouble and starts fights, and so everyone hates him. But because he's low-born, he doesn't have the capacity to cause as much evil in the world as someone who's a great king. So that was a really interesting thought I had that Socrates makes here. You've got your petty annoying people or your petty wrongdoers, but they're not as bad. They don't cause as much evil in the world as really powerful wrongdoers like the great king. So that's an interesting thought.
It's a very interesting thought, and it must have been the kind of thought for someone like Marcus Aurelius, who would have known this, of course, to be like, well, I've got more to lose than anybody else, probably.
Exactly. Yeah, because he had absolute power. And it's hard for us to even, in a sense, we can't even conceive of someone who has literally absolute power, not just over, the government in a sense, but over the lives of people. Everyone, essentially everyone in the Roman Empire was literally, their lives were at the mercy of Marcus. And luckily, he was a merciful and considerate and intelligent and good man. But when you've got someone who's not in that position, then they can do incalculable harm.
That's what I was going to say. But unluckily, he put his son in charge. He got most of it right.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And in fact, Socrates kind of makes the sort of the cognate point, or the point developing out of that it's very difficult to live a virtuous life when one's power is immense. It's very hard. The more power you have, it's like a ratchet system. The more power that you have, the more difficult it is to live virtuously in a self-controlled way. But he points out, and I think I raised this last time, that an exception to that rule was Aristides, who was a Athenian politician who was known for being a man of integrity, and his nickname was the Just. But people just got sick of hearing him being called the Just, so they just got rid of him. And that's what democracy's like, you know.
Yeah.
People have the stupid reasons for doing what they do. That's democracy. We got to live with that.
Another point that you could draw from this is that, you know, people with great power are kind of exempt from toil and suffering, basically. So, of course, they've got more opportunity to do bad things because they live in the lap of luxury. So, you know, we could say the same thing about societies or, you know, privileged cultures or privileged groups of people who may not have to struggle very much at all. Like, you know, I'm thinking of my own generation. Really, whenever anything difficult comes up now, it's earth-shattering. There's a lot of entitlement, but there's also probably a greater difficulty. I don't know, I'm very much generalizing here. There could possibly be a greater difficulty for people to really grow because they're not pushed into hardship and difficult situations very often. And I think Socrates makes a good point, you know, sort of as a practical point, that difficulties and suffering and the kind of things that low-born people especially, or normal people, are going to experience throughout life kind of make them more humble and reasonable and gentle and caring and empathic, because empathy means to understand, you know, what another person's going through, for example.
Yeah, and of course the Stoics picked up on that. So you've got Seneca with De Constantia Sapientis, the steadfastness of the wise man. You know, this whole idea that hardships are sent, at least in part, to develop the character of people who are capable of benefiting from that. So yes, I think that was definitely something that was going to be developed later on. And again, I think Christianity picked up on that as well. And it feeds into the whole idea about, well, why do we have evil and suffering in the world? Well, at least part of that is because it helps us to become better people, essentially, and exercise our virtue.
That's right. And Freud, for example, I think would even have it as a basic feature of differentiation, because he says, like, the infant baby, when it's just born, attached to the mother's breast, it has an oceanic kind of feeling where it hasn't learnt cognitively or physically or whatever that it's separate from the mother until the mother's breast is removed, because at that point it experiences pain, and from that pain it experiences the notion that it is separate from the source of pleasure. So it's only through suffering that cognitive differentiation starts to occur. And then, of course, as it becomes more differentiated, the being then, knowing it's separate from other things, then has to learn adaptive behaviors to seek out the source of pleasure, to be able to meet its needs and satisfy its desires and things like that. So it's only in the absence and the pain of those things that a being is able to learn to thrive. So interesting how the psychologists pick up the same sorts of ideas.
Yeah.
But yeah, you could imagine the perfectly pampered emperor baby who's hardly ever had an experience where there wasn't a bosom in his mouth, for example.
That's right. Well, maybe that was Commodus's problem. So where does Socrates go from here? So yeah, so he has quite a big speech here, and Socrates finishes up by saying, not seeming, but being good is what we should aim for. And the next best thing is, if we do wrong, is to be disciplined for that. And also, every kind of flattery and gratifying people for the sake of it is to be avoided. And interestingly, Socrates finishes up by saying, be guided by me. Emoi un petomenos. So that's that verb about persuading, influencing again. Be influenced by me, and you will come to no harm if you're a good and upright person, because your way, Callicles, is worthless. He's very explicit about that right at the end. So
And
we've come to the end of this amazing dialogue with so much ground covered.
We made it. Yay.
Yay.
But there was a bit there too where he returns to the point about getting punched on the jaw and not being able to defend himself. And he says, right. You in the afterlife will look like that person who's been punched on the jaw. You will have no way of defending yourself against Rhadamanthus and those sort of judges.
Yeah. He brings that out because that was something that Callicles came over referenced more than once, is this violence thing, and Socrates comes right back at him about what's going to happen in the next world.
Yeah, more than just the violence, the fact that Socrates can't protect himself.
Yeah, exactly.
And he says, well, after when you have to face your judges, you won't be able to protect yourself with those arguments.
Yeah. It's a wonderful dialogue, and there's so much stuff. I mean, we really only scratched the surface all the way through, haven't we, Courtney?
I loved it, and I can't wait till the next one. And to be honest, it's really improved some of my understanding of Stoicism. It's been wonderful, and it really makes it obvious how much people interested in Stoicism would benefit from reading these dialogues.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's think about what we do next. So do you want to do Euthydemus, which is, I was going to say Theaetetus, but Theaetetus is really long. I'm kind of a bit bogged down in Theaetetus with my blog posts. So yeah, let's do Euthydemus, and that's much more manageable. It's kind of fun as well. It's a fun dialogue.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Yeah, sounds brilliant. Let's do that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Courtney.
Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.